Okay, so I am recording. If you don't want to be on the screen, go ahead and hide your face. Or if you don't care, you can stay on with your face.
Or
All
just
right, so
close your
it
eyes. Close your eyes and you
is.
won't see your face, and there you go. Problem solved.
There you go. All right, so we have another one join. Bradley, I'm going to let you introduce yourself, give you a little bit of background because I know not everybody knows you. So, yeah, the floor is yours.
All right, cool. Thank you, Sean. Appreciate it. Appreciate y'all that joined up to hear this talk. I will do my best to not be boring. So my name is Bradley Gore. I'm a software developer. I've been developing for about 12 years now, 11, 12, something like that. About 4.5 years ago, I started my own company, Adabra. So you can find us at adabra.tech. And I just do general consulting. So in with doing consulting, so I worked for consulting companies for several years before starting my own thing. And I worked with a plethora of different industries from the education sphere to the automotive sphere to my main thing the last few years has been restaurant point of sale. And so I primarily right now do a lot of backend development with Go. I also do front-end development with React, but we have some pretty good, Sean included, he works for my main customer right now. And we have some pretty good front-end developers on that team, so I don't have to do as much. But I still like to, put my shovel to work, so to speak, now and then in the front-end world, but mostly focusing on Go. But for this talk, what we're going to go over is just some troubleshooting tips and tricks. So these are just things that I've either learned through the years, or some of them maybe even just learned recently, that I've added to my tool belt as a developer, and felt that they might be helpful to some other folks as well. So let's get into it. So I called it elementary troubleshooting. So I am a fan of Sherlock Holmes, and since troubleshooting is kind of like sleuthing, you're going to see a couple images and terms and whatnot that are kind of going to tie into that. There's not any kind of like, big tie-in at the end. It's just something I just kind of did throughout. So elementary troubleshooting, so kind of like foundational troubleshooting. So the game is afoot. So we've got, typically when you're troubleshooting, you've got a thing that is doing something that you don't expect it to do. Maybe it's doing the wrong thing, and I've had this personally happen, maybe it's doing the right thing and you don't even understand why. You're like, this shouldn't be working, but it does, and I don't understand why or how. So for the agenda tonight, what we're going to go over are what we go through when we troubleshoot. So some of the things that I think about, one of the things I kind of came up with for this talk is a thing I call the I's and Y's of troubleshooting. And it's kind of almost like a mnemonic device, I guess, really to kind of keep it in your head, like a series of steps to go through when you're troubleshooting to help expedite or help kind of serve as a guide for, I'm here and I want to be over there. How do I get there, right? When you're trying to figure something out. Then we're going to work through some dev tools, tips and tricks. So these are going to be browser based. However, there's a lot of non-browser based things that support a lot of the things we're going to do as far as like how to use logging and how to use that kind of stuff. So note that on the console there, I've marked it as our prime suspect. Again, there's not really any kind of real meaning there other than the console is what everybody seems to think about when they think about debugging or troubleshooting. They just console log everything, and that's not intended to be an insult. If you console.log stuff, I console.log a lot of stuff as well. But there are other mechanisms that we can use and other mechanisms that can be more useful in the proper times or in the proper places. So also we're going to look at Node.js. Node.js has what's called a REPL, which is read eval print loop. We're going to look at that, and we'll look at some other resources. All right. So to get started, the I's and Y's of troubleshooting. So if you remember these things, you will have kind of a roadmap for when you're troubleshooting anything. So the first thing is to identify. It's really difficult to troubleshoot something unless you can clearly identify what is versus what is wanted or what is expected. So let's say I have a function called adder, and it takes two numbers, x and y, and it returns the addition of those two numbers. So if I put in 5 and 2, it should return 7. Well, if it returns 9, if I put in 5 and 2, then it did something wrong. So the first thing is identify, what is it doing? What is it supposed to be doing? And that sounds very simple in the example that I gave, but a lot of times it's not that simple. A lot of times it's like, oh, we have this, this big process, and only when the data looks a certain way, or only when the file system looks a certain way, does that process do some unexpected thing. And so the first step then, you have to take the time to really identify exactly what you're working with and exactly what things look like at the time that it does the thing that it shouldn't do. So the next thing that we're going to look at is investigate. So once you've identified what is versus what is wanted, you can then start investigating. And a lot of times I found if I take the time to really thoroughly identify what is going on, it really helps me in narrowing down where to investigate. So if I've got, just to use very broad terms here, if I've got an application that has a caching layer and a database layer, and I identified that something is off in the cached results that are returned, that's where I'm going to start. And I'm not going to start looking in the database layer. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm saying that you're never going to end up all the way back at the database layer. That's certainly a possibility. But if you do a thorough job of identifying exactly what pieces are in play, your starting point is going to be a lot closer to the root of the issue. And a lot of times, kind of Occam's razor kind of thing, that's going to be where the problem lies. So we investigate and then we isolate. So isolating is a thing that I think that something that I could always do better at. I feel like that it's something that I don't keep in mind enough. And so maybe that would apply to others as well. So the main thing with isolation is, now that I've investigated the thing and I understand, okay, it happens only on this specific scenario. So maybe adder function, let's go back to that example. Maybe adder function works properly for every numbers except 5 and 2. For whatever reason, it does something goofy. So we isolate it. We make, one of the ways to isolate that is to make a test case explicitly for that scenario. Then you can run that test case on its own. So and we're all writing testable code, right? So you can run that test case as many times as you want in isolation and run it with that specific scenario in play. And a lot of times it's going to be bigger than something like the trivial example I give of adder, but the principle still applies. Once you find the pieces, or the piece, if it's just one piece that's not working properly under a specific scenario, you isolate that, you write that unit test that forces that scenario, and now you can reproduce the issue. Now you iterate. Now you make a small change. And this is a thing that I see a lot that that I feel like that is something that we could really do a little bit better job of slowing down here. And when you iterate, you don't have to try to go fix, you don't have to try to go rewrite the whole function and then run the test case, right? Make a small tweak. Make a small tweak and see exactly what that small tweak does. I mean, complex things, you have a lot of dials and levers and stuff, right? And so you don't want to just go change a bunch of dials and a bunch of levers and then hit run. And then if it's still broken, now you're kind of like, well, okay, well, which of those things aren't right? I've changed 20 things. That's really difficult, and it's really setting up for a difficult time. So iterate, and I would advocate, especially, this talk is really geared more towards what I would call kind of like the beginner or even like beginner intermediate folks. Maybe you've been doing this a few years, maybe you've just started. Either way, heck, even senior folks. You know, I've seen senior folks make this mistake. I've been a senior folk that has made this mistake. So I'll put it that way. Slow down a bit, iterate in small cycles. And then why? So the I's and the Y's. So we've done our I's, and now we understand, now we get to, we've iterated, and now we figure out why. So I have why listed 3 times here. That's actually really important for this talk and for this principle. So it's not enough just to fix something. Go deeper and then ask yourself, why was it broken in the first place? Maybe a surface fix is all that's needed, but maybe something deeper is needed. So there's a principle called the 5 whys of something. I forget what it's called, but Toyota came out with it. And basically, their engineers, whenever they found, let's say, I think if you look up like on Wikipedia or something about this, I think the example that was given, I'm going to go off memory, and so my memory isn't great, so I could be off a bit here. But basically, the gist of it is this: let's say a car comes into the Toyota dealership to be fixed, right? And they look at it, they see that there's oil coming out of the engine. Well, that's not good, right? That's real bad. So they pull off the valve covers, and they realize that the gasket has a leak. So they could just replace the gasket there. Sure, that's the first why. Why was there oil coming out of the engine? Well, there was a gasket that was leaking. But one of Toyota's principles, and Toyota's one of, or actually I think the biggest car manufacturer in the world, and has one of the best records as far as reliability and stuff. This is one of the reasons why that they've built that reputation, is because they wanted to go through like 5 levels of why. They trained their staff, their technicians and engineers, and they said, look, when you see a problem, you don't just fix the problem and stop there. You take it a step deeper. Well, why was that gasket leaky in the first place? Maybe there's a certain material that we're using in our gaskets that once they get to a certain age, they rot real quick. Or maybe once they get to a certain temperature, they become brittle or something. Maybe there's all these different things. So let's start. If you're not the one that can do that test, raise that issue up the chain or across the room or whatever, and ask who can initiate those kind of tests, who can answer the next why. And what you're going to get to is a lot of times you're going to find out that the thing that you fixed at the first thing that you found isn't always the proper or the last thing that you should fix in this chain. If you take it down another level or two, you're probably going to fix something else. That's best case scenario. But worst case scenario isn't even bad. Worst case scenario is that you gained a deeper understanding of how this thing works at a deeper level. So don't discount taking that extra time to answer a couple levels of why. All right. So the first thing that we're going to, oh, I forgot about these. I forgot about the quotes. Sorry. So we've got some, I wanted to find a neat quote about tools because I like tools. I like tools that do a specific job and like make your life easier for that thing. And so I don't know who David Allen is. I just found it on the internet. And so it's got to be true. But the quote was neat. It says, if the only tool you have is a hammer, it's hard to eat spaghetti. And so that's one of the reasons that I thought this talk would be really good, especially for kind of those entry people, is that, console.log is what we see a lot of the tutorials use. It's what we see a lot of books use, etc. And there's a lot more tools than just that one thing. And so if this, my goal here is that this introduces a couple more tools. So let's take a look at a demo with some dev tools. So what we're going to look at is we're looking at something pretty fun. So let me get out of this. And who has a website? Who has a personal website that has like maybe an animation or maybe like some kind of thing on it? Anybody? I need a volunteer.
I don't have animation, but it is a website. Do you have to have animation?
Or like a transition or something that visibly changes the DOM that we can inspect?
If no one else, let me think of something.
Okay, does anybody have a website? Because I don't want to use like a canned one that I know about that people can be like, oh yeah, he like totally prepped for that. I want to do something kind of like, that I didn't. So does anybody have a obviously WorkSafe website that maybe has an animation or has a slider or has a thing on it that you think is interesting and you want to maybe get a peek at how it works?
Old WordPress sites that had sliders in them. I don't know if they're still alive though.
Okay, let's do. Well, I thought that with some people in here, I thought we'd maybe have some volunteers. I don't know. What's just somebody name a site that you like to use that maybe isn't a site that is like Amazon that like everybody knows about. Okay.
A lively bunch today, right?
Sean, you like Tesla, right? You're a Tesla.
I do.
Tesla guy. Okay. Do they have anything cool on their website?
This is more fun than anything I could have come up with.
All right, let's do this.
Everything on their website's cool.
Well, they have an uncaught reference error right there in their right there.
Whoops.
Oh wait, that might be my ad blocker. Never mind. If it's the ad blocker, I'll forgive them. All right, so check this out. What I want to do? Let's see. Let's find something interesting. Okay, so they have a slide out menu. Very standard thing, but maybe you've been tasked with building a slide out menu and you've never done it before. Okay, so one of the things that you notice is that whenever I click on this, it changes. It highlights in purple over here in the body tag. Can everybody see the dev tools here?
Yes.
Okay, so it highlights in purple there. What's going on? Now, what if you were like, well, I want to know actually how they're doing this. I want to know, like, I want to see as much of the code that I can see. Well, there's a pretty cool thing. I'm going to do what's called an element breakpoint, okay? And I'm going to right click on the body and I'm going to say break on. And I noticed that it was getting a class added and removed. So I'm going to say attribute modification. Class is an attribute of body, right? So it's an attribute on the body tag. So I'm going to say, hey, when this attribute change, when an attribute on this body tag changes, I want to know about it. Okay, do you guys see what just happened? It just totally broke, right? Totally hit a breakpoint. And I have in my call stack, I have the different things that have been hit. And let's pretty print this because this is obnoxious to read if it's not. Cool. So we have this. I've never looked at this code in my life. I don't know what this means. TDS prevent scroll. I couldn't tell you. But what I can tell you is that this is where they're changing the class name on the body. They're adding this has open mask, page has open mask. They're removing it, etc. And they're unchecking a checkbox and all kind of stuff. And I can see like what local things are. So, okay, so let's set a breakpoint in this function. And I want to try to figure out, what what's calling that function. Unfortunately, it is not giving me anything in the call stack here. So let's try another tack. Troubleshooting is never straightforward. You have to kind of like meander a bit. You know what I mean? So let's meander a bit. I want to inspect this element here, and I want to see what happens to this element. So when I close it, see I've got this nav element selected. When I close this, does that just go away? No, it doesn't. It gets hidden. Okay. So let's do this. Let's break on that one. Let's break on an attribute modification. And then let's remove the break on the body. All right, cool. So let's see what kind of stuff we can get into here. It doesn't look like that we're actually changing that one at all, are we? Live stuff never goes as easily as you plan. I don't know if they're not changing the subtree. So I don't want to just do the body. Looks like I'm gonna have to though. I'm gonna break also on subtree. Let's just see here. Yeah, so the weird thing is that normally in a call stack, what you're gonna see is like what are all the things that led you up to this point? And it's a little bit interesting that it's not. So I'm wondering if they're just doing it with CSS, which is possible. So if we go down here to our nav, oh, that's interesting. So you see this checked selector? So if we go back to our source code, we can see where they were doing t.uncheck checkboxes, and it has this TDS header checkboxes. Again, I've never looked at their code. I have no idea how their code is structured, but I do see this unchecked checkboxes. Let's step into that and let's see what that does. Because what I think is going on, I think they have some hidden checkboxes. And then what's happening is they're selecting the checkbox when it's checked, and then using the sibling selector here to select the TDS menu header nav. And that's when they're saying that like the display would be initial, right? And they're setting all of its display stuff. That's what I think. Yeah, and then here they're setting its right to 0. Well, if the right wasn't 0, see how, okay, now we figured out how they're doing it. They're not doing it with JavaScript, they're doing it with CSS, which is actually better. In this case, because there's not really a reason to do it with JavaScript. So very cool. All right, so we can then go in, and if we really want to, we can, oh, okay, interesting. So we can set other breakpoints, right, and see what's going on. But I want to see what's going on with the checkbox thing. I'd like to step into that if I can. It may not actually break on that. There we go. It's so different. I'm not seeing them. I'm not seeing, but you see these, you see where I'm hovering over the inputs, right? And it's just like they're hidden. They're not actually
right.
They're blending in essentially. They're invisible, I guess. So we can see them here. Yeah, the opacity is 0. So if the opacity, you see that, look above the T in Tesla. If I uncheck the opacity 0, we can see the checkbox. So what I think we could possibly do, this would be cool, is I think we could check this, okay, and then we'll hit play. Oh, because it's, okay, because it didn't have a handler on it, it just reloaded the page. So if they'd had like a prevent default or something, like a check handler on the checkbox, then it probably would have opened the nav, because what they're saying is that it's checked. So, but anyways,
so
yeah, that is, I've not seen checkboxes used like that before. That's really
I have
interesting.
not either.
So let's do this. Let's say so we'll again use our dev tools here, and let's just get all the inputs. Is it type equals check? Or is it checkbox? I don't remember off the top of my head. Let's see.
Yeah, I think it was checkbox.
Is it box? Yeah. There we go. Okay, cool. So let's do this. Let's do this one here, and let's just set this thing's checked value. So I'm just going to say $0 checked is true. Okay, so we probably have to call the on change. We probably have to fire an actual like click event. There we go. What happens if we click it again? So I guess I'm not sure why it's not checking, because yeah, so they're changing the class of the body, so it's got to have the right class on it, plus the input's got to be checked for the nav to show up. Because what's happening here?
Well, they're adding that class right? Right 0.
Yeah, that's the style that they're adding, right? So the checkbox here, let's see. Is that the checkbox that's actually controlling it, or is it this menu main trigger? Ah, that one's checked. Maybe that's the main one. So let's just click on, there we go. Okay, geez. Live coding, never as easy as you hope it would go. All right, let's do this then. Let's clear our breakpoints.
Yeah, you're brave for taking this long. A lot.
Yeah, well, hey.
I love it. It's odd to me that they're even using a checkbox for this.
It is to me too. I've never seen this before, and so that's why it's like, that's why it's so different. But oh wait, let me go back to the input. I gotta go back to this input. Here we go. So what should be happening now? I'm gonna do click, boom. So so I would have not ever expected. I expected, because I've done this talk before, and I frankly expected to break on like an attribute change or a subtree modification. So subtree modification is like if you, like, let's say the navigation didn't even exist in the DOM until after you click this, and it's like, oh, append child, and you pass in the navigation stuff, right? So if you've done a lot of jQuery, you're like, oh, append and prepend and all that stuff, right? So this is a bit mind-blowing to me because I've never seen this used before, but I'm going to call this a mission success here, because we did prove out that we can use the troubleshooting techniques here to basically identify, right, what's it doing. Maybe there's nothing wrong. Maybe there's nothing that we don't want it to do. We're just saying, hey, this navigation comes up somehow. I want to know how they did it if I want to replicate it. So, and then we isolated it, right? So we identified it, we investigated, looked at the DOM, looked at the JavaScript. We realized it wasn't even a JavaScript thing, it didn't seem like, or at least it wasn't a lot of JavaScript things, just checking boxes. And we're like, what is that all about? We isolated our checkbox and we iterated. So demonstrated that those principles work. Okay, cool. So the element breakpoints are awesome. So just to show that one more time, I right-clicked on an element, I go to break on, and I have all these things I can break on. So go have fun with that. That can actually provide a lot of interesting stuff. I think in the last talk I did on this, I did Walmart has like a slider thing, and I was like, hey, I wonder what they're using for their slider, and it was some kind of I think it was a jQuery thing, but we were able to like dig in and pinpoint exactly what it was, because on a timer they had it going, and I was like, oh, so here's how they're controlling like the request animation frame and the set timeout, or whatever mechanisms they were using to control that. And it was really interesting, right? So if you see something that you like somewhere, know that there's various ways you can dig in and figure out how is it doing what it's doing. Another thing that's really cool is you can, some really common ones, click to select. You saw me use that on the nav. So you click this icon here, and then as you hover over things, it kind of shows you where you're at as far as like the popovers. And when you click it, it selects it in the DOM tree. Also, what you can do is you can do Control F, and you can look for things like, I could look for inputs here. And I believe, I think that it will do query selector. So like input type equals checkbox. You see that I'm doing the actual query selector syntax here. And it lets me iterate through those. Okay, so another one is get event listeners. So let's say I want to understand, I think it was this input here, the main trigger. Let's say I want to understand what exactly is going on here. So I can do event, or is it document? I don't remember. I do not remember. There is a get event listeners mechanism. I should have. I apologize. It's been about 2 months since I gave this talk, and I thought that I remembered it well enough to do it without another go round of practice, but apparently I did not. Well, let's look it up because it's interesting. They're saying it should be on window.get event listeners. Oh, okay. Oh, there it is. Okay. Yeah, sweet. Okay, so apologies there. So we can just do window.get event listeners, and we can pass in an HTML element, and it will tell us what listeners that there are. It'll also tell us all the different things about it, like if it's a one-time listener, if it's passive, what type is it, like click or whatever, which it's on the click object, so I'm going to hope it's a click listener. But you can also go into the listener here, and I think it'll give you, yeah, there we go. It'll give you a link where you can actually go into the file. So here again, we're in code that I've never seen before. I don't know where to go look at stuff, for this thing. And here's the event handler for that, for that checkbox. So lots of different ways to try to dig in and evaluate things and try to, all these different things are really just different tools to put in the tool belt. Sometimes you need a Phillips screwdriver, sometimes you need a flat screwdriver, and that's how I like to think of these things. I don't really think of any of these things as like a one size fits all type thing. I kind of think of these as like, these are just the tools to keep in mind that whenever I'm on my next task, I think about, okay, well, what are the things that I've used out of my toolkit that could come in handy this time, right? So let's look at everyone's favorite tool, which is the console. So I'm going to open up a web browser here. HTTP server is what I'll be using. HTTP server, if you haven't used that before, it's an npm package that will just run a static web server in any directory. And so if you have an index.html file in that directory, it'll serve up that file. And so I've got some fun console demos here that we'll look at. All right, so the first thing is console.assert. Console.assert is something that you can use to do just kind of what it sounds like, and that's to assert things. And so first off, let's just do clear to get a clean console. So let's do this. Let's do console.assert, and we're going to say true does not equal true. Okay, that's the assertion. And then if it fails, we're going to give it a message to print if it fails. So you've seen like in unit tests and stuff, or maybe you're like, assert thing X is equal to thing Y, or assert thing X is not equal to thing Y, that kind of thing. Well, you can do that here in the browser, and it will it'll actually print out an error. So probably don't want to ship that to production, but if you want a quick way to do like an equality check or something kind of straightforward like that, and then have it log an error if that's not the case, then you can do that. Another thing that's interesting about the console is whenever you do things that cause something else to print, it runs everything kind of in a sandbox thing. So you see it's like VM212. So it shows you like the script that that caused that to happen, right? So and that's important because we'll use that in a second. So let's clear our console again, and there's several of these little console tips and tricks that we're going to use. So I'm going to go through these a little bit quickly. But if I'm going too quickly, then definitely go ahead and stop me at any time and ask a question. That's totally fine. So the next one we'll look at is console.group. Console.group is pretty handy. So do console.group. Actually, you know what? I think I have some of these canned in my test file. Oh, there we go, yeah. So let's do the console.group. All right, so what this does is it prints out a group. So if you look here, I'm collapsing this. And let's say we have a database thing, or we're getting some data from the API and we want to list out all of our over limit customers. Let's pretend that we have some limit thing or whatever. Well, these are assertions that failed, right? So let's look at that code real quick. So I have some dummy demo data here, and it's very basic. It's just got, let's just pretend these are users, and they each have a GUID and a flag if they're active or not, what's their current balance and age, eye color, if for whatever reason we care about eye color, all that kind of stuff, right? So what we're gonna do is we're gonna have some utils that help us kind of like do some troubleshooting of like what's really going on with our customer data, what's it really look like. So let's take a look here, and we're gonna do this console.assert. It iterates over that demo data. It says, here's our max balance. It checks the balance of the customer. It goes ahead and it creates a message for in case they're over the balance. And then we could do something like this if. This if would work just fine, right? How many people have done this before? I've done this. I still do it all the time because I forget about console.assert. So I could say if the customer's balance is greater than our max balance, then we debug this thing, or we console.error or whatever. But how much nicer is it just to say, hey, console, assert, and if this criteria is met, log this message as an error. Otherwise, don't do anything. I don't need to hear from you if this criteria is not met. So that's super handy, especially when you're troubleshooting a thing. And how many, I don't know, maybe I'm the only one that's done this, but I've literally been in a for loop, and I found out that item 37, and this was like before I really knew that you could do conditional breakpoints and stuff like that, which we'll look at in a second. Or before I knew that you could do stuff like this, I would literally count, and I would hit the play button 36 times, and I'd be like, okay, now I'm on the 37th thing, and now I'll step through instead of stepping over. Maybe I'm the only one that's done that. I'm not going to force you to answer, and you know, but hey, I've done it, and this is way nicer, right? All right, so then let's look at another one. Let's clear that. Let's do a collapsed group. So you saw earlier that I had to collapse the group myself. Well, you can actually do console.group collapsed, and all the stuff that you put in it. So you see you have console.group and group collapsed. All the stuff that you put in the console afterwards, it automatically goes. See how I hit enter, it just disappeared? Well, it went into this collapsed group. So I can do foobar and baz, and it automatically goes in this collapsed group. Pretty handy. You can nest groups as well. So I could do like console.group collapsed, group 2, and then I could do some other debugs, and then to end the group, you just console.group end. Keep in mind that the console grouping is not super intelligent in that you can like start a group, start another group, into the first group, and then later on into the second group. It makes you go in order. So if you start 3 groups, with the first group that you end is going to be the innermost group, then the next group you end will be the second group, and you do them in order. So you can't like specify start this group, then start that group, and it's not like a log distributor where you can say, I want to have a log channel for this and a log channel for this and write to this one and that one for different things, right? It's not like that. But what we've got here is we've got, check this out. So we've got our main group that has all this stuff. You can see where we created another collapsed group. That group too has all this stuff. So if you're troubleshooting a thing that has like multiple stages or multiple steps that go through this thing, and you're like, man, I'm just trying to figure out what the heck is going on, and you got a bunch of these, well, console.group collapsed is your friend, because maybe for each thing you create a group, log through the whole way through that thing, and maybe at certain like main steps of that process, you create a new group inside that group. Now you can see basically almost like a tree, but not quite, but you can essentially see like a whole series of data in a context that's better than just made it here, line 137, item number 36, you know? Or maybe I'm the only one that's written those kind of console logs. All right, so let's clear this out. Let's do some more. So another one is, what if I want to track the time that it takes for something to run? So we can do console.time. Console.time is fantastic. And what it does is it basically says that when you start a thing, you can then call time in. You start a thing with a label. That's the API of it. Console.time takes a label. And this one is more intelligent because it knows that you don't have things necessarily happen sequentially. Like with grouping, it like expects you that if you've created a group, it wouldn't make a whole lot of sense if you create a group within another group to like end the parent group before you end the child group. That really wouldn't make a lot of sense, right? Timing of things is a lot differently. Maybe I have a parent process or a parent function that kicks off another function. And maybe the parent's job is done once it calls the other function. So you could end that time if you're tracking the time to complete functions, but that child function has its own time maybe, right? You start a timer with a label for that child function. Well, you don't care, or the timer mechanism doesn't care that you ended the one before the other one ended. It doesn't matter. All right, so what we should see in our debug, I need to click all messages here. So after I did console.time, a little bit of time passed, and then this got printed out. So it was an asynchronous thing, right? So it just kicked it off, and sometime later it ended that thing. So let's do another demo here. So you can see here that I did a console.log after 500 milliseconds and a console.log after 1,000 milliseconds. And you can log these with some context. Apparently it doesn't handle emojis though. So that was supposed to be a thumb up emoji, but I never changed it because I think people get the gist. But let's look at that. So what's happening here is that we are sleeping for 500 seconds. Then we're doing a time log. Okay, so here's a cool thing. You log to the timer label that you started the timer under, and you logged some context for it, right? So the API for that is that it takes a label of string, and then it takes a variadic argument that's just any data you want to pass to it, just like console.log would. But it's console.timelog. And what that does is it labels it saying, hey, look, this is a time log, right, for the demo timer. Because we gave it this label, right? Or the time log demo, yeah. And then it sleeps another 500 milliseconds, and then it ends that timer. So timers are an interesting thing. So we can say we have that label. This is our label, right? The time log demo that we just used. So if I tried to do console.timelog and I try to pass in that same label, because that timer's already ended, it's not gonna let us do it. It's really smart. And it says, hey, this timer doesn't even exist. What are you talking about? You can't do that. So that's one thing to keep in mind, is that like I wouldn't treat timer labels as things that you can kind of go back and write to after the fact. Once you've closed a timer, once you've ended a timer, then that's it. You can't really go back and add more context to it later. So that's something to keep in mind. Interesting thing about groups though, so to kind of circle back around to a thing we already covered, groups, I don't think they'll error out. So if you do console. Oh, yeah, sorry. It won't, because it doesn't use the label. So I can pass in something like, you notice that it titles the group here, how I've labeled it. So G1 is the label of the group. And I can say console.group_end now. And maybe I want to write to G1 again. It doesn't work the same as timers. Nope, that's not supposed to be group end, it's a group. So it starts in a new group. So timers are a little bit different than groupings, even though the signature is a little bit the same, as far as it having a label mechanism, in that once you end a timer, you can't write to that timer again. But I could do console.time, and I could do time log demo, just like with groupings. So when I use the label again to start a group, it doesn't like reuse old group. Same thing with timers. It's gonna do that, and I'm gonna say console.timelog, and we'll just do the same thing, and then console.timeend. And quick gotcha here: if you don't pass in a label, it's gonna default the label to default, and it's gonna throw you an error if you haven't like started a default timer. Or at least I thought it would. Maybe it's that it starts. I'm not sure why it didn't do that, because it should error out if there's not a timer. Or is it the group one that does it? I don't know. That's interesting because I think that it used to do that. Interesting. Well, we'll just end that timer then, and it'll be ended. All right. Don't do a talk off memory. It's not the smartest thing apparently. Okay, so let's do a couple more timers because those are fun. So we'll do a couple different timers that kind of interweave with each other. So you can see I've got timers B and A. Timer B let us know that its current step was 1, current step was 2, then it ended. Timer A finally told us it ended. But if we look at the code, timer A would have been kicked off first. So we see console.time label A, and then after a sleep, we see label B. So that's kind of just, there again, showing that the timer doesn't really care what order they start and stop in. They're not, not like groups. So it's pretty interesting to see. And so you can get a lot of detail that way. So you can say like, oh, I've got a function that does some calculations, and then it calls an API, and then it does a thing. And then based on the API results, it maybe does some more calculations, right? Let's just make something up. And so you're not sure, you know that that's running slow, but you're not sure yet, is it the pre-API call calculations that are slow? Is it the API call itself that is slow? Or is it the post calculations that are slow? Or is it some mix of one or, any or all of the above? So using timers like this, you can get a good rundown of like, oh, the pre-calculation is only taking 5 milliseconds. The API call is taking 90% of the time, and the post calculation is taking the other, little bit of time. So then you know exactly where your issue lies, right? So you can really further dig into what you want to happen, as far as like who should investigate what. If you're not the back-end person, or if you are the back-end person, you now know, hey, I don't need to waste my time debugging the calculations on the client side. Those are fast. I need to figure out what is going on with the API call. Maybe it's network latency. Maybe it's, other stuff. So, and then with the, what I did here was I just made that timer demo have a little parameter where I can tell it to use groups. And it's mixing timers with grouping. So you notice that when I started timer A, I started a group. When I started timer B, I started a group. I went ahead and did all the logs for timer B and logged them under the group of timer B, then closed out that group. And then when timer A was completed, I closed out timer A's group. So pretty handy if you had there again, like a nested process or nested like routine type thing that you're trying to figure out, okay, why is this taking so long to come back? You could have, picture this being like the top level of the call, and timer B here being like the API call. And you would log out, okay, I made the request now, and then you'd log out, I got the response now, and then you'd say, I did the next calculations, and you could get a lot of useful information from that, right? All right, so I think that's it for the timer demos. Let's see. So let's look at tracing. Tracing is pretty useful. So, all right, so I did console.trace, and I get a whole bunch of stuff printed out here. One of the things that I notice off the bat is I get the record that I'm working on printed out. I get some links. What's this process record? What's this anonymous? What's this promise.then, right? So all these things are happening, and maybe I didn't really know where all this stuff was going on. Like maybe I know that for the use case for this demo is that we've already processed some data. Okay, so we're saying, hey, we shouldn't be reprocessing this data. We've already processed it. Okay. The cool thing about console.trace is it dumps everything out, and it basically dumps the stack trace, hence console.trace, right? It's the trace of the stack up to this point. And so we can see, how did we even get here? All right, so let's take a look. Well, there again, the VM thing, it was just us in the console doing console.trace. That's our demo. So that's not what we want. So let's look at the other one, the other links that it gives us. All right, well, let's look at this. What is this? Index 4134. Let's look at that. Okay, so there was a sleep, and then there was a function called process records called. Okay, we're getting closer probably to what's actually happening. Let's go to the next link here, if you can see that. And all right, in the process records, it creates a promise and it does some stuff, and then it does a then. All right, so let's keep going. Let's see what else is going on. We have this anonymous function here. What's that? That's the then handler. Okay, so when this promise is successful, then it does this. And we get back to where in process records, it does a check to see if it's seen this record before. And if it has seen this record before, then it calls console.trace and it says, hey, we've already seen this. We shouldn't be seeing this right here. And it spits out the whole, it spits out the data record, right? Which is just our fictitious person record or customer records, whatever you want to call it. But what it does for you is it also prints out this whole stack. So I can see everywhere that this record touched, right? So now we can try to figure out, well, okay, well, why was this record touched again? Well, fortunately, it's demo code, so it's going to be simple, right? So in the demo code, we can see that we're resolving this promise with two records, just random records from the demo data. And so it's going to process those again. Unfortunately, real code is never that simple, but the principle remains. And you see that we have two outputs here of data that we've already processed in two totally different user records, right? So if you look at the GUIDs, you look at the names, all that kind of stuff, they're different. So the principle remains the same, that if you have you're running through something and you realize, wait, this shouldn't even be getting here. How did this even get here? Well, you can do some kind of check to say, well, if this is happening, dump a trace out, and let's follow the whole path that this thing took to even get here. And it does a pretty good job, as you saw, of even async stuff. So you saw that it went through a promise.then and a promise, and then process records, and another promise.then to do the to call process records again here. So pretty useful tool to have in your tool belt. All right, let's clear that one. And let's do another one. So the console does a whole lot more than logging, right? So let's look at console.dir. I don't remember, let's see. Is that the wrong thing? Console. Yeah. Oh, no, I remember. All right, so yeah, sorry, I am going off memory, and that's my bad. So console.dir is an interesting thing. So let's just go to like Indian real quick, and we'll open up the dev tools, and let's just get some kind of element here. So let's get like this div here. So we can do console.dir, and we'll pass in this element that we've got selected. So if you want to examine the DOM and you want to look at it almost more like an object, right? Versus like here in the DOM tree, you do console.dir and you pass in a DOM node, and it'll print that for you. And I find that handy sometimes, just to get a quick look at like, here's all the attributes. And it can be a bit I kind of threw it in as almost like an add-on to this talk because it can be a bit overwhelming because it kind of gives you too much information. But I have seen times where there's been a property that I forgot that I forgot even what it did or even that it existed, and I've used something like this to like print out the whole thing, and I'm like, oh, what's this property do? Or it's a good way to learn new properties, right? So you're like, oh, what does what does auto capitalize do? Well, maybe you've not seen that before, and so maybe you want to look it up, right? And so it can be useful. I would say this is one of those things that it's not my go-to, and I'm not advocating for it to be a go-to. I'm just saying that it's another thing to know about and another thing that is useful. All right, one of my favorite things that I've saved for last on the console demos is console tables. I use this a lot. And it's something that is just super, super handy. So console.table, check this out. I printed out all of our customer records, print out their full name and their balance. Oh, what's this? I can sort in the console. Yep, yeah, you can. It's like basic sorting, but it's pretty spiffy. Okay, sweet. What if I wanted to do other stuff with that? Like what else can we do with console table? Well, turns out you can actually group these, put these in a group. So let's say I have a whole bunch of stuff like this that's just, right, it's just a bunch of data. And I don't always want it to clutter up my console, but I might want to reference it while in this, like, I make sure that like console statements are pretty well cleared out of the code before we push them up. So I'm not saying leave this in your code forever. What I'm saying is like when you're actually troubleshooting something, maybe you throw a good bit of stuff in a table and group collapsed it so that it starts off being collapsed. And then if you realize that, oh yeah, I do need to reference that table and I need to quickly look at like what are the key, and I would just table out the key fields of that collection of data if you're dealing with like an array, right, obviously. And then you'd be like, okay, well, if I'm looking for the thing at index 10, which record is that? Oh, Buckley Tyson. Okay, I'll be able to do a find in my data set, whether it's my database or whether it's a JSON file, like I'm pulling it for test data or whatever, and I'll be able to find that record. Okay, what's different about that record than the others? Maybe it's something about the data itself. Maybe something got messed up in the database in that row. I mean, if you do backend development, like that, you do migrations on databases, and databases like they are fluid for the most part, just like your code is, right? Just like client-side code. You might change the shape of an object, you might change the shape of a table, and use these things called migrations to say, hey, this table used to look like this, and now I want to transpose the data and make it look like this, and maybe that table becomes 2 tables, or maybe 2 tables become 1, or whatever, right? And so maybe something is just off in the data itself, and so you can pretty quickly identify with kind of combining these tools like this if there's an issue with the data that's, maybe some piece of data is different than the other ones. A field is missing, a field is the wrong type, a field, I don't know, those are kind of the 2 most common things if you're talking about a specific field. You can pretty quickly identify that kind of stuff. All right, and then we can do conditional breakpoints. So if we go into our sources here, and let's just go into, let's go into the trace one where we're saying, where is that process record here? So if the scenerex.index of data, right? I mean, we added a breakpoint on line 4121. And let's just edit this breakpoint, and let's do something interesting. Let's say that the index has to be divisible by 2, right? So we're gonna say scenerex.index of data mod 2 is 0. All right, so I'm sorry, I mean evenly divisible by 2. All right, so let's do this, and let's do the console.trace. All right, cool. So we have hit our breakpoint, and let's just verify that our breakpoint conditionally worked here, or that our conditional breakpoint worked. Let's see what the scenerex.index of is. the scene.rex.index of this data is 82. Well, that's divisible by 2. Cool. Notice that we didn't hit that breakpoint again. I hit play and we didn't hit that breakpoint again. So what that tells me is that one of these records that was processed again, right? So that's the only way that scene records would already have it indexed. One of these had an index that was evenly divisible by 2. One of these did not. That's not really important for troubleshooting. The principle of doing conditional breakpoints is important. So if you have a scenario that's happening and you're like, man, it's only happening for the record where the guy's name is Bob, or whatever, the amount is greater than 500. Well, rather than doing an if statement in here and then using like the debugger keyword or going in and then setting a breakpoint inside the if statement and then having to remember to undo the if statement when you actually commit the work back up, just do a conditional breakpoint. Data amount or balance greater than 500, whatever, right? And then the browser is going to evaluate that expression, and it's going to say, well, the operator wants to break here, but only if this expression equates to true. Does it equate to true? Yes or no? And if no, then it doesn't waste your time. It doesn't bother you, right? So pretty handy. All right, I think let's look at the oh, debugging, yeah. So there's one more. One more console demo, and it's called, I forgot what I called it. StackNet, or no, it's just called debug. That's right. All right, cool. So let's take a look at this. So what this is doing, if we look at the code here, so there's a function called handle even, and it basically just asserts that our index mod 2 is 0, so it's an even number, right? Then there's a function to handle odd, and it just says demo data for each, handle even, handle odd. But then there's some logic here that's like, oh, if this is the case with the index, go ahead and call these other functions. And it's like, well, why is it logging these assertions, right? And so you could then dig into it, and you could have these assertions, and you can go through the stack, and you can say, oh, okay, well, this one happened because this specific scenario happened, right? So again, not overly, this specific scenario isn't something you're going to run across in the wild, but the principle remains the same of saying, hey, let's use these different tools, these ways to like print out a stack, print out something that we can actually physically work with, you know, that we can navigate here and say, okay, well, what's going on here? All right, I think, yeah, so another thing that I like to do is short-lived globals. And I know that we kind of have, it used to be back in the day that globals were a very common practice. Now, not so much, especially with like JavaScript bundling and stuff and modules, right? ES6 modules. We don't really need them that much anymore. It's not the thing that where it's like jQuery was like globally imported into the page and every single thing you had to do was globally imported. Now you can import modules, and so you have 3 different versions of a thing, and it could all work on the same page, and presumably without a problem because they don't mutate the global scope, right? However, when you're troubleshooting things, let's say that I've got this this thing here called API service, and it does get data and set data, and that's all it does, right? So I'm going to set a breakpoint here at the end of API service, and let's say that I want to be able to use the API service whenever I want. I do this a lot because I'm building a lot of backend stuff at the moment, and we have a front end, and a lot of times the front end, of course, can't build out its side of it until the back end's done. But I want to go ahead and interact with a thing the way that the front end is going to. So what I'll do is we already have like kind of mechanisms that are common tools essentially in the front end for communicating with the back ends. It's a WebSocket API. And so what I can do is I can just launch the front end and I can grab a handle to a thing, even though it's in a module. So pretend this is a module, right? This is a module we've imported. I can't get API service globally on the window, but what I can do is I can set a breakpoint where it's defined, and I can reload the page. Oh, I can actually just call the function in this case. If it's in a module, you'd reload the page, right? And so that way you'd get the actual initialization of the module going on. So I can say window, if I can type properly, window.api service equals API service. All right, cool. So now what I can do is I can say API service.get data. And so what that would let you do is that would let you interact with, let's say you're building out that API, or maybe you're on the client side and you're trying to just do some testing. Before you build out the actual integration with that API, you want to just play around with it. And so maybe you've got like a wrapper that does all your socket comms for you, and you just have to tell it like essentially what endpoint and what data to send. Well, you would just throw that on the global, and then you could be like, oh, hey, API service, I want to get this data, and here's the arguments I want to pass into the server. And you can just inspect the network traffic and see what happens. So globals are not a thing that I use like in the real world as far as purposefully put them in the code, unless it's like a library or something like a jQuery or something like that that's meant to be global. But globals are a thing I use in a short-lived fashion like this, and I find them extremely useful. All right. So one other thing, oh, here we go. This is, yeah, I knew there was a better reason I had this stack nav demo. All right, so I'm gonna go back to the stack nav demo real quick because there's a better, there's a reason that I did it separate. All right, so we're gonna call this stack nav thing here. And when we do handle even, we can see that something is getting called here, right? And we can say, okay, well, the index needs to be divisible by 2. And so let's just update our breakpoint. Let's make sure that we only break when that's not the case, okay? So we're gonna say index mod 2 is not equal to 0. And let's just go and break on the next time that it happens. Okay. So what we get when we've broken is a stack trace here. So you see the call track or the call stack, yes, a call stack, sorry. And you can navigate this thing. So interesting thing about call stacks, and this is really useful in like loops and stuff. So we can see where we kicked it off right here, because again, that VM file name that's used for like when you run stuff in the console. So we kicked off this debug.stackNav. We then go up and we see that we're iterating over some demo data. We go up and we realize that this anonymous function was called. And it's obviously bogus logic. In the real world, you'd see different logic, you know, of course. But sometimes things in the real world get as goofy as this, because, and I'm not slandering anybody's code but my own here. Sometimes we write things maybe in a hurry, maybe with an incomplete understanding of what should happen in a scenario, and we look at it a few weeks down the road when we're trying to troubleshoot the bug that we introduced, and we say, huh, why did I write that? Why did I do that? Why did, you know, why is this even in here? Again, maybe I'm the only one there, but it is a thing that I've experienced. And this is really useful to be able to navigate the stack like this. Another thing that is really cool is what if I want to start over? If you've ever been in a loop type scenario and you kind of like lost your place and you're like, oh crap, I forget which thing I'm on or which index this is, and maybe you don't have the variables right like right here in front of you where you can just see what they are. maybe maybe you need to start over for some reason. Okay, so this is cool. So I'm going to right click on this debug.stackNav. I'm going to click restart frame. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to set a breakpoint. I'm going to set a breakpoint right here so that we're right inside this for each. And so right now we're on what index? We are on index. Let's get into our thing here. We're on index 13, it looks like, right? Okay, so let's go back to this one and let's restart this frame. And now let's see what index that we are on. All right, so we're at stack nav. And if you can see that, because we hit our breakpoint here at the beginning of the loop, we're back on index 0. So what we've essentially done now, with great power comes great responsibility. If the thing that you're working on makes API calls that are manipulating data for real and stuff like that, maybe don't do this. But if you're locally debugging and you're trying to figure out something and you're in a loop and you're like, man, I just need to if I could just restart it from here, maybe it's really painful to get it to there, right? Maybe you haven't been able to isolate it to the point that makes it easy to just start off in the broken scenario or start off in the problematic scenario. So you just go back to your call stack and you say, okay, I know it went wrong here. I don't really want to have to redo everything from beyond that or before that to here. Restart at this frame and let's try to follow it a bit closer and see what's going on. That can save you a ton of time and a ton of effort. All right, so I think that is it for the in-browser testing. I'm going to disable the breakpoints here. Before I do a really quick example with Node, does anybody have any questions or any anything they'd like maybe a clarification on or anything like that?
I do, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Is there one of these console features or that you tend to gravitate to and use a lot more than others?
So just to be perfectly transparent, a lot of what I'm doing right now in the past like 4 or 5 months has been backend development. So it's a little bit different because I'm doing Golang for the server for the WebSocket API and various things like that. So it's a little bit different because it doesn't have the same it doesn't have the same API as far as like logging. There's not like grouping and there's not like that kind of stuff. And if you print a stack trace, it's just text. Although it has gotten better. Like in the editor, if you print it in the integrated terminal, it'll turn the text into like links so you can jump right to the file. So that being said, before my main focus was backend development, I do a lot of console.table for front-end development because a lot of times I find that I'm working with lists of things, I'm working with arrays of things, and especially for if you're building a report or if you're doing any kind of aggregation like that, and you're like, man, I've got, I'm taking these objects and I've got to like, maybe you're doing a map or a reduce, right? Well, it's good to have like exactly what those objects look like right there. And so I'll just table those out real quick, the columns that I want, because what you can do, let's do this. What you can do, I'll just look at the table example real quick. So you can, if you see what I'm doing here with the map, I'm saying, hey, on this demo data, I've got a bunch of properties. I don't know how many there were, maybe 8 or 10, 12 properties. I don't really want to see all those properties in the table, but I want to see these two things. I want to see their full name and their balance. So I'm going to map that data and into an object that's just full name and balance, right? So console.table is something I use a lot for like quick looks at all the data, and especially like I said for aggregations, like if you're doing report building and stuff, and you're just like, I just want to see what all the aggregations are. Maybe your report isn't showing the data that you think it should show. And you're like, man, something's got to be off. And all of a sudden you print out just the figures that are involved in maybe one identifying column, like the UUID or receipt ID or transaction ID or whatever, however your data is modeled. And you would have the fields that are actually at play, so you don't have to try to like scroll through left and right. And all of a sudden you see like a nan, right? JavaScript, you have the nan, like not a number. Well, that's going to throw things off because anything with any sort of arithmetic to nan, it becomes nan, right? So that's fun. So console.table is a good one. I use that a lot. a lot of the other ones I use, to be again transparent, I use when I remember them on a lot of things. The grouping thing, things kind of have to get tough for me to like really want to group things, but it has come in handy several times for me. The assertion one I use, I've used the assertion one quite a bit as well, not near as much as console.table. But yeah, I mean, so those are kind of the three main ones that I've found to be useful. Doing the trace is really useful if you're like, I got here and I don't already know how I got here, and I just want to trace out the whole thing so I can walk through everything that was ran up to this point, and then I can get a better sense of how I got here. That one is really useful on code you didn't write. On code you wrote, a lot of times you kind of know it well enough to know, if I got here, I know kind of how I got here already. But there's been a lot of times on code that I didn't write, or again, to be honest, code that my past self wrote. My past self was slightly dumber than, at least I hope, my current self, and I'm dumber, I hope, than my future self, right? Slightly. So my past self wrote a thing, and my present self is like, man, why'd that guy do that? And how does this even work? And so you trace it out and you can walk through it. Maybe it's been a year since you've looked at that code. So there again, that's why I kind of said these are really just tools in your tool belt. Philip, it would be easy for a person to say, oh, I think a Phillips screwdriver is the best. Well, maybe they're an electrician. An electrician normally uses a Phillips for like all the connectors and stuff, except for like the face plates. Though a lot of times those are flathead. But just to give a random crazy example, so maybe they'd say, I think Phillips is the best. Well, maybe in another industry, a person wouldn't even use Phillips or flat. They use Torx, right? The star-shaped ones. In automotive, you see that a lot. The star-shaped screws. Well, so that's Torx heads. So that person might say, I think that's the best. So I'm trying to say the best one is whatever fits the need the best, I guess, in a little bit roundabout way. I try to avoid using words like, oh, this one's the best one to use, and this is how I always do it, because I don't really believe in that. I don't really believe that there's like a best or an always tool. I think that tools are for specific purposes, and they're best in those specific purposes typically. Does that help or not really?
Yeah, for sure, absolutely.
Okay, good. All right. So Node.js, were there any other questions or anything else?
Yeah, I actually had a quick question, and forgive me for an elementary question. I'm a recent graduate from a boot camp, so I'm pretty new still. But I noticed that like you're writing like D console dot, table. What is the D at the beginning for?
Oh, sorry. That's just it's a little convention I came up with for this. It's for demo. So rather than, I didn't want to actually pollute the global, like what console actually, let me just show you here. What you can do, because it's JavaScript, I can say console equals this object, okay? So now where console.log used to be a thing, now I can do console.log foo, and it gives me an error because console is no longer that. So this is basically me saying my demo console, right? And because there is a console.assert, and I wanted to have my demo console, it's an object, right? It's just an object that I can add properties to. And those properties are named the same as what the actual console has. I just didn't want to overwrite what the actual console has. Is that helpful?
For sure. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, cool. Yeah, anytime. I'm happy to. All right, so final thing that we'll go over is I'm just going to run Node real quick, and I'm going to show you a package.json. Package.json for this demo has one dependency that we don't actually even use, but it's Luxon. Luxon is a date time library. If you've looked at any date time libraries ever, you'll know that they are non-trivial. They are always complex. There's always a lot to them because time, by its very nature, apparently is non-trivial and complex and has a lot to it. So let's say I want to learn a new thing about Luxon. I want to play around with it. I've never played around with it before, let's say. I have, but let's say for the demo, we're trying to learn more about it. So we can say const. So if you saw here in the terminal, I just typed node, and I entered this, what's called REPL. That's read, evaluate, print, loop. It's this mode where you can type in stuff and Node will give you back stuff. So I don't know, let's do something like, let's just say var cat equals in the hat. I can say cat, and it gives me back in the hat, okay? So dumb example there. So let's say const lux equals require, okay? And we're gonna say lux on. And so you notice that I do get IntelliSense. So as I started typing, I can type LO and nothing shows up, but if you kind of see the ghosty letters back there, it's LUXON that shows up. And I can hit tab and it'll finish it. It's actually really, really slick that it gives you that. And so you can examine, like if I had 11 different packages installed into here, it would know what ones were in the package JSON and it would try to help me out in that way. Pretty handy. So I can say lux dot, and what exactly is on the lux? I don't know. I don't know what's on lux. So I'm gonna do lux dot and I hit tab twice. I know that you can't see that, but if you heard the clicks, I hit tab twice and it shows me all the different things that are on lux. And there's a whole bunch of stuff. If you see this double underscore naming convention, that's stuff that's essentially private because it is JavaScript and there's really not a such thing as private in this context. But the stuff that I care about right now is stuff like this: date time, duration. So that's kind of neat. Okay, so what's lux.datetime? What is that? Oh, it's a class. See that? Okay. So I should be able to do something like maybe like new lux.datetime, maybe? I don't know, but I get an error. Okay. Whoa, this is cool. So I get a link that I can click on that it goes here. Apparently the lux on datetime constructor takes some kind of config and it tells me that it needs to have like a time zone and all kind of stuff. And if it doesn't have that kind of stuff, it throws an error. Okay, well that's not fun. Maybe there's something else. Maybe datetime has something on it. Okay, let's try that. Nope, datetime doesn't have anything on it. What can we do? So what can we do? There's got to be a way to do a lux on date. I don't know. Maybe from like a JSON date. So maybe we say like const JS now equals new date. So JS now, so it's a date, right? Maybe we can do like lux. Oh, there we go. That's what I was missing earlier. I was like, there's got to be stuff off date time. Oh, so this is cool. Okay. Here we go. It looks like that there's ways that I can do date time from JS date, and I can pass in JS now. Cool. So that gives us a lux on date time. So you see that? So if you're like, hey, I just want to play around with like a node package. Now here's the kicker. Okay, you can't pull in browser stuff into this and do the same thing. There are people that maybe have done scrapers and whatnot. They're gonna be like, oh, well, what about JS DOM? What about Casper and all that kind of stuff? Yeah, I know that's out there, but that's not really what I'm talking about. I'm talking about like you couldn't pull it. You couldn't just, without having HTML files to pull in and DOMify essentially with like JS DOM or something, or Casper, and without going through all that stuff, you wouldn't be able to pull in something like a DOM manipulation library to like change, swap out nodes or like a jQuery. You wouldn't be able to do that here because it's not in the context of a browser. There's not like a global window and a global document and that kind of stuff, right? But what you can do, maybe you've got a math lib, or maybe you've got a maybe you just want to do some, just do some, I don't know, create a function and see what happens. Oh, maybe you've got a big JSON file and you need to like map it to something, right? So I don't know, maybe let's do this. Let's create a file. Let's say example. Again, live coding is probably never the best idea, but we're gonna do it because we're crazy. All right, so we're gonna say name Lester tester. And we're going to say, let's just make a bunch of names, right? This is just a name dictionary that, you know, whatever. I don't know of a good S that means like testing or something. I'm going to say, I'll just do some basic names. Okay. So we've got some JSON. So, okay, so check this out. We can say const example data equals require example data. All right, see that? Live coding. So I don't have anything like crazy worked out here, but let's say you're learning some functions and you want to like play around with like, well, what does map do? Okay, well, check this out. So let's say we want to do example data.map, okay? And you can even like just hit enter on stuff and it'll just tell you, oh, it's a function. I mean, it's not as nice as like telling you the parameters and all that stuff, but it's a function. You know, it tells you what it is. Is it a class? Is it a function? Is it a value? Whatever, you know, like a string or whatever. All right, so let's map this data to something. So map takes a function, okay, and the function should return something. So let's say like we get P for person, and let's say we want to do something like, let's just do a ternary. Let's say like Lester test name, and let's return if their name has Lester in it, let's return a different object altogether, name, and we're going to say not less. It's not less here. Okay, it used to be less here, but now it's not less. Else we're just going to return the person as is. All right, so if you see the ghosty text underneath, I haven't hit enter yet. I haven't told it to run, but what I have done is I've completed the statement enough that Node can go ahead and like pre-execute it, essentially execute it like separately and go ahead and show me what that result would look like. I can hit enter and then it actually like, you know, solidifies the output, whatever. But if you're wanting to play around some functions and stuff, this is probably one of the quickest ways to get to do it, right? So you can create functions in here. So like, let's say we want a function called adder, function adder. And the signature is that it takes X and Y, and those are numbers. Okay, check this out. I do an opening curly brace, and I hit enter. Node is smart enough to know that, okay, I'm in the middle of a statement, like a function or an if block. It would do the same for an if block. It would do the same for like switch case, like that kind of stuff, right? So it knows that I'm in the middle of like a multi-line statement. And so now I can do other stuff. I can say, well, let's just do that. We can say if x mod 3, so if it's divisible by 3, if it's that, then let's say return x plus 2y, right? So we'll do x plus 2 times y. I don't know. We're just being silly. All right. So if that, oh, you know what? Let's just make it nice and clean. Oh, look, it indents even further. So now we're going to say return x plus 2 times y. Okay, which wouldn't make any sense at all in a real program, but we don't really care. Now I'm going to close the curly brace. Now notice that my indentation is back out. It didn't unindent the closing curly brace because it didn't know that it was coming, but it's better than nothing, right? Else we're just going to return x plus y. Okay, x plus y, and then we're going to close our function. And now you see the adder is defined. And I can say adder, and let's say we're going to pass in, I don't know, 10 and 17, so 27. But what if we had passed in 9 instead? Okay, well, obviously 9 and 17 is not 43, but it's a dumb function, right? It just does silly things. So, but it's a good way to like troubleshoot. And so if you've got like a JavaScript function and you're trying to figure out, well, why is this working so crazily? That's part of isolation, right? Maybe you pull up your node and you just copy that function to just a quick JavaScript file, and you just export just that function as much as possible. I mean, once you kind of build things kind of intertwined, it's hard to isolate things. And I would say that's definitely a trademark of a really senior engineers whenever they can write things that can be isolated and can be testable like that. And so I would say, if you get anything at all from this talk, I hope that it's that. I hope that it's that you think about, if I have to deconstruct this function or this process, right? If I have to deconstruct this whole thing and troubleshoot any specific point of it, is it even possible with the way that I've written it? And if the answer is no, I would you know, just encourage you to take another look at it, see if there's another way to structure things so that if I have to pick out just a piece of it to troubleshoot that one section of this thing, then it's doable. That's worth its weight, and it's worth the time to do it. All right, so I think that is essentially it. So we'll get back to the talk. So we went through the read eval, print loop, the package playground, and just how fast Node is as far as like getting you iterating over things. So a couple resources I'm going to share with you. The Chrome and WebKit, their dev tools are astounding. That's what we did the demos in today. Those are the dev tools that I always use. They're just fantastic. Firefox's dev tools are also really, really good. And they have documentation on all their sites about that stuff. And there's also documentation about Node's REPL. If you just Google it, of course, I'll also share the slides, which will have the links. You can see the documentation on the REPL. There are some limitations on the REPL, but it's not bad. I think a lot of them I went through already just here. And yeah, so that's basically it. So if you have any questions, fire away. And thank you so much for attending.
Awesome. Thanks again, Bradley. I'm gonna go ahead and turn off the recording.